The dust was the first enemy, a choking shroud of golden grit kicked up by 10,000 wheels and 100,000 feet. It tasted of the Syrian desert, of metal and of fear. Through this swirling haze, the world was reduced to fleeting, terrifying images. A rearing horse with wild eyes, the splintering crash of a chariot's axle, the glint of a bronze khopesh swinging in a deadly arc. The ordered lines of the world's most disciplined army had vanished, replaced by a maelstrom of bronze and blood. Screams in a dozen languages echoed over the din, a symphony of chaos where survival was measured in heartbeats. At stake in this swirling vortex of violence was more than just a battle. It was the fate of an empire that had stood for millennia, a civilization that believed itself to be the center of the cosmos. The very concept of divine order of Ma'at was being torn asunder on this foreign field. If the army broke, the northern territories would be lost, the trade routes severed, and the heartlands of the Nile left vulnerable. An entire age of unparalleled power and prestige hinged on this single, desperate moment. A defeat here would not be a mere setback. It would be a wound from which the empire might never recover, a scar on history itself. In the eye of this hurricane stood a single man, his chariot a small island of gilded wood and gold in a sea of slaughter. He was young, impossibly so for the weight he carried. He was meant to be a living god, the Horus incarnate, a warrior king whose every step was guided by divine will. Yet here he was isolated, his personal guard fighting desperately around him. His grand strategy had collapsed into a brutal fight for personal survival. He was the commander, the pharaoh, the son of Ra, and he was watching his world burn down around him, a consequence of his own ambition and a single, fatal miscalculation. How did it come to this? How could the mighty Pharaoh, Ramesses II, lord of the two lands and 100 vassal states, find himself encircled, his finest divisions shattered or scattered, facing annihilation at the hands of an enemy he was told was over 100 miles away? What was this accursed place, this bend in the Orontes River that was poised to become the graveyard of his legacy? What was the name of this monumental battle, this crucible where empires clashed and the course of history would be forever altered by the outcome of this desperate, bloody day? The answer is Kadesh, the Battle of Kadesh. And in that moment of near oblivion, something shifted. The trapped pharaoh did not break. Instead, history, or at least the history he would later write, tells us he roared a prayer to his divine father, Amun, and charged. Alone, he supposedly drove his chariot into the thickest of the enemy ranks, a god of war unleashed. The immediate aftermath was not a clean victory, but a brutal, grinding stalemate born from this act of defiant courage and the timely arrival of reinforcements. Ramesses survived, but the illusion of his invincibility was shattered on the anvil of Kadesh. The world of the 13th century BC was not an empty stage waiting for heroes. It was a complex web of superpowers, a geopolitical chessboard where the players were ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless. In the south lay the eternal kingdom of Egypt, the new kingdom at the zenith of its power. To the north, nestled in the highlands of Anatolia, was the formidable and enigmatic Hittite Empire. Between them, a buffer of rich city-states in the Levant, the lands we now call Syria and Lebanon, served as the prize. For generations, this region had been the bleeding wound between these two colossal empires. The city of Kadesh was the jewel in this contested crown. It sat astride the Orontes River and commanded the major trade routes connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. To hold Kadesh was to hold the key to Syria. To lose it was to cede control of the north. Ramesses' father, the great Seti I, had managed to bring Kadesh back into the Egyptian sphere of influence, but its loyalty was as shifting as the desert sands. Upon Seti's death, the city once again defected to the Hittites, a direct challenge that the young, ambitious Ramesses II could not ignore. Ramesses II was not a man to be trifled. He ascended to the throne with a burning desire to surpass the legends of his predecessors, especially his father. He was a builder on a scale unseen before, commissioning temples and monuments that would awe the world for millennia. But a pharaoh's legacy was not just carved in stone, it was forged in battle. He saw the recapture of Kadesh not just as a strategic necessity, but as a divine mandate, a chance to etch his name into eternity as Ramesses the Great, the conqueror who secured Egypt's glory forever. To achieve this, he mustered one of the largest forces Egypt had ever fielded. An army of over 20,000 men and 2,000 chariots, divided into 4 grand divisions, each named after a primary god: Amun, Ra, Ta, and Set. This was a statement of power, a rolling city of warriors, scribes, and priests snaking its way north from the capital of Ramesses. The logistics were staggering, the confidence of the young pharaoh absolute. He believed he was marching towards his destiny, utterly unaware that he was instead marching into a brilliantly laid trap. His adversary was Muwatalli II, the great king of the Hittites. He was a shrewd, patient, and calculating ruler, a master of strategy and diplomacy. While Ramesses was bold and ostentatious, Muwatalli was secretive and subtle. He understood that a direct confrontation with the full might of Egypt was risky. Instead of meeting Ramesses on an open field of his choosing, Muwatalli decided to choose the battlefield himself. He gathered a massive coalition army, pulling troops from across his vast empire, and hid them in the one place Ramesses would least expect, right behind the city of Kadesh. The first act of this grand deception was subtle. As the Egyptian army advanced, they encountered 2 Shasu Bedouins, desert nomads who claimed to be defectors from the Hittite cause. Brought before the pharaoh, they spun a tale of fear and disarray. They swore that the Hittite king, Muwatalli, was terrified of Ramesses and had retreated with his army far to the north, to the region of Aleppo. It was the exact news the young, confident pharaoh wanted to hear. He saw no reason to doubt them, for their story confirmed his own belief in his divine might and the cowardice of his enemies. This single piece of false intelligence was the pivot upon which the entire campaign would turn. Believing the enemy was miles away and Kadesh was lightly defended, Ramesses made a critical tactical error. He broke his army's tight formation. Eager to seize the city, he pushed forward with his lead division, the Amun, moving far ahead of the Ra, Ta, and Set divisions which followed miles behind. He crossed the Orontes River and set up his camp just northwest of Kadesh, completely exposed and dangerously isolated from the bulk of his army. The illusion of safety was shattered when Egyptian scouts captured 2 more men, this time actual Hittite spies. Under harsh interrogation, the truth was beaten out of them. It was a revelation of pure horror. The Hittite army was not in Aleppo. It was here, right now. A massive force of nearly 40,000 infantry and 3,700 heavy chariots was concealed just on the other side of the city. Ramesses was not approaching a vulnerable target. He had marched his lead division directly into the jaws of the largest ambush in ancient military history. The blood must have run cold in his veins. Before the pharaoh could even process the terrifying reality and send warnings to his trailing divisions, the trap was sprung. Muwatalli unleashed his chariot corps. But these were not the light 2-man chariots of the Egyptians, designed for speed and firing arrows. The Hittite chariots were heavy 3-man war machines, essentially the battle tanks of the Bronze Age. They carried a driver, a warrior, and a shield bearer, and their purpose was to smash through enemy formations like a hammer blow. And that is precisely what they did. The Hittite force thundered across the Orontes and crashed directly into the flank of the Ra division, which was still on the march and completely unprepared for an attack. The impact was catastrophic. The Egyptian lines, stretched out and vulnerable, disintegrated almost instantly. Seasoned soldiers who had never known defeat broke and fled in panic, streaming towards the relative safety of the pharaoh's camp. It was a complete rout, a wave of destruction and terror rolling relentlessly towards the isolated Ramesses and his Amun division. The panicked survivors of the Ra division poured into the Amun camp, sowing chaos and fear. They were followed closely by the Hittite chariots, who smashed through the camp's flimsy defenses with impunity. The carefully ordered Egyptian camp, the pharaoh's own headquarters, descended into a bloodbath. Chariots overturned, tents were set ablaze, and the elite soldiers of the Amun division were forced into a desperate, swirling melee for which they were not prepared. The Hittite objective was clear: kill the pharaoh and decapitate the entire Egyptian army in one swift, brutal stroke. It was here, amidst the collapse of his army and the ruin of his ambitions, that the official Egyptian account focuses. The inscriptions on temple walls at Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel tell a story of divine intervention. They depict Ramesses abandoned by his men, his heart filled with despair. He calls out to his father, the god Amun, pleading for aid. And Amun, the story goes, answered. The god filled the pharaoh with a supernatural strength, making him a whirlwind of destruction. According to these reliefs, Ramesses personally mounted his chariot, Victory in Thebes, and charged the enemy encirclement 6 times. He claims to have single-handedly scattered thousands of Hittite chariots, his divine presence burning like a fire among them. I was before them like set in his moment, he would later have inscribed. I found the massive chariots in whose midst I was, scattering them before my horses. It is a stunning piece of propaganda, portraying the king not as a flawed commander, but as a solitary demigod holding back the tide of darkness. While the tale of a lone pharaoh defeating an army is almost certainly a dramatic exaggeration, his personal bravery in that moment is less debated. Faced with certain death or capture, Ramesses did not flee. He rallied his personal household troops and the remnants of his division, forming a desperate pocket of resistance. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, and his stand, however embellished, was crucial. It bought him the one thing he needed more than anything else: time. As the Hittite forces were bogged down in the chaos, gleefully plundering the rich Egyptian camp instead of pressing their attack to its conclusion, that time paid off. A completely unforeseen event occurred. A separate Egyptian force, a unit known as the Nerin, arrived on the battlefield from the north. The origin of this force is a mystery debated by historians to this day. Were they an elite unit on a separate mission, Canaanite allies, the vanguard of the Ta division arriving by a different route? Whatever their identity, their arrival was a miracle for Ramesses. The Nerin were fresh and battle-ready. They smashed into the flank of the now disorganized Hittite charioteers, who were preoccupied with looting. Caught completely by surprise, the Hittites were thrown back in disarray. Their momentum was broken, and the attack on Ramesses' position faltered. This gave the beleaguered pharaoh the breathing room he needed to regroup and reform his lines. The battle, which had seemed decisively lost only an hour before, had suddenly and violently shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. Ramesses seized the opportunity. Now reinforced, he led a counterattack, driving the Hittites back towards the Orontes River. What had been a disciplined assault devolved into a desperate flight for the Hittites. Many were driven into the river and drowned, including several high-ranking Hittite officers and allies, a detail Ramesses would later delight in recording. By evening, the battlefield was a grim tableau of wreckage and bodies. The Amun and Ra divisions were shattered, but they had survived. The Hittite chariot corps was severely mauled. The following day, the battle resumed, but its character had changed. The Ta division had finally arrived during the night, bolstering the Egyptian numbers. But the Hittites still held the field and brought forth their vast infantry reserves, which had not yet been committed. A long, grim day of fighting ensued, but neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Both armies were exhausted, bloodied, and battered. Muwatalli still held Kadesh, and Ramesses' grand plan of conquest was in ruins. Tactically, the battle was a bloody, horrifying stalemate. Ramesses, recognizing he could not take the city, and that his army was in no condition for a prolonged campaign, withdrew his forces and began the long march back to Egypt. But a pharaoh could not return home in defeat. And so began the Second War, the War of Propaganda. Ramesses commissioned a massive public relations campaign, the likes of which the ancient world had never seen. He ordered the story of Kadesh to be carved onto the walls of every major temple in his kingdom. In these official versions, the battle was transformed. The strategic blunder, the intelligence failure, the near-total collapse of his army, all of these inconvenient details were omitted. Instead, the narrative focused entirely on the pharaoh's personal, divinely inspired heroism. It became the story of how Ramesses, abandoned by all, single-handedly defeated the entire Hittite host through his courage and favor with the gods. It was a masterpiece of political spin, designed to cement his image as an invincible warrior king. The Hittite records, discovered millennia later on clay tablets in their capital of Hattusa, tell a very different story. They speak of a great Hittite victory. From their perspective, their objective was met. They had stopped the Egyptian invasion cold, inflicted devastating losses on the pharaoh's army, and retained control of Kadesh and, by extension, northern Syria. They viewed Ramesses' withdrawal as a retreat. The mystery of Kadesh is that both sides claimed victory, and from their own perspectives, both were right. The years following the battle were not peaceful. The victory at Kadesh solved nothing. A tense and draining Cold War settled over the region, with intermittent conflicts and proxy wars flaring up in Syria. Both empires poured vast resources into maintaining their military footing, a costly endeavor that benefited neither. The world had changed. A new menacing power was rising in the east, Assyria. This aggressive new empire threatened the borders of both the Hittites and the Egyptians, creating a common enemy that overshadowed their old rivalry. About 15 years after the bloody clash at Kadesh, the political climate had shifted dramatically. Muwatalli II was dead, and the Hittite Empire was experiencing internal instability. Ramesses, now a more mature and pragmatic ruler, recognized that a military victory was impossible, and the constant state of war was unsustainable. The two superpowers, exhausted by decades of conflict and wary of the growing Assyrian threat, decided to do something unprecedented. They decided to talk. The result was the eternal treaty, also known as the Treaty of Kadesh. It was not a treaty of surrender, but a pact of equals. A silver tablet was engraved with the terms, declaring an end to all hostilities between the two empires forever. It established a formal border in Syria, contained a non-aggression pact, and most remarkably, included a mutual defense clause. If a third party attacked Egypt or the Hittites, the other was bound by treaty to come to their aid. It was the world's first known collective security agreement. The treaty was a stunningly sophisticated piece of international diplomacy. It included provisions for the peaceful extradition of political refugees, a major point of contention between the two powers. To seal this new era of peace and friendship, a grand diplomatic marriage was arranged. A Hittite princess, daughter of the king Muwatalli II, traveled to Egypt with a magnificent dowry to become one of Ramesses' great royal wives. The former enemies were now family, their empires bound by blood and silver. Copies of this treaty have been found in both Egypt, carved on temple walls, and in the Hittite archives in modern-day Turkey, preserved on baked clay tablets. It stands as the oldest surviving peace treaty in history, a testament to a pivotal moment of human consciousness. It marks the point where two mighty civilizations, after fighting one of the largest and most technologically advanced battles of their age, came to the profound realization that shared existence was preferable to mutual destruction. So who truly won at Kadesh? Was it Ramesses, who survived annihilation and crafted a legend of personal glory that echoes through eternity? Or was it Muwatalli, who successfully defended his territory and halted the expansion of his greatest rival? The mystery lingers, but perhaps the question itself is flawed. The true victory did not belong to a single king or a single empire. The victory belonged to the idea of peace itself. History is not simply a chronicle of battles won and lost. It is a story of turning points, of moments where the trajectory of human interaction shifts. The Battle of Kadesh was a brutal, chaotic, and inconclusive clash of arms. But its ultimate legacy was not the carnage on the field, but the revolutionary document it inspired years later. It proved that diplomacy could be a sharper weapon than the kopesh, and a treaty more enduring than a fortress wall. In the end, the blood-soaked soil of Kadesh gave rise not to a conqueror's victory, but to the very concept of international peace, a closing thought on how the greatest conflicts can sometimes forge the most profound paths to cooperation.